Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside David Corbin. Glad to have you with us to explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020 vision.
Well, the people have spoken, Dave.
Overwhelmingly. Twice the amount of podcast downloads as any ever episode we've had, I think so.
Yeah, we had a massive uptick. So yeah, you probably thought we were done with the election, but no, we're focused on ourselves. Yeah, big spike in downloads. Well, whether anyone listened, that's another question, but we're gonna do our best. We've got some new microphones. Thank you, Dave, for springing for that. So the sound quality should be an improvement. But the main reason we got back on was mostly because we did pretty well with our predictions. Unlike our track record, where we've had more misses than hits, this time around, we did pretty well.
Well, I'm claiming I won every state. I know that I went back and forth on Pennsylvania and then hinted that I might go for Virginia, but I think I get 50 out of 50, at least if you listen to last week's episode the right way.
Backward, yeah. Yeah, well, I didn't quite do that well. I was wrong on Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, but had Michigan as a state that would put Trump over the top. So we had an interesting evening. We were texting back and forth. I don't know what you were following. We don't have cable, so we weren't able to watch Fox. Well, not at least Fox News. Like the Fox C team has this free Roku channel, which was very interesting. We settled on ABC, which as the night wore on became more entertaining, of course, because as things were obviously headed Trump's direction, you could see the despair growing on the faces of the various anchors.
Well, here in the Corbin household, my wife was incredibly nervous. She started to listen to AM radio more and more and has really gotten into the whole electoral politics scene. But I had nerded out around 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time and had my go-to checklist of the 10 things that would have to happen that would indicate one direction or another.
Yeah.
And after about the fourth box being checked in a certain way, I thought that Trump was in pretty good shape with regard to the election, that he was up somewhere between 3 or 4 points in most places and really had a chance to win the popular vote, which is, I think, what's going to end up happening here. He'll win the popular vote and then maybe even get over 50%. So that it was interesting. But I like you, I have more channels. We have cable. We probably have way too many channels. But we went back and forth just for the comedic element to it, because Fox had declared Trump as the next president of the United States. I don't know, 11:30, 12:30 Mountain Standard Time. I stay up until 2:30, 3:30, which is like 5:30 Eastern Standard Time.
Right.
And watch ABC, and they're still wondering if there's a pathway to victory for Vice President Harris.
Right.
Like, what world are we living in here? No, it's not going to happen. So it made for a little bit of a waste of the Wednesday, but I knew that going in, and it was such a monumental victory, I think, for the Trump team, that I knew that as a student of politics, there'd be a lot to think and write and speak about thereafter. So here we are.
Yeah, so here we are. One of the things that was interesting as we kind of get into a little bit of a analysis of what happened and what it means, we want to take our usual step back, a little broader context, but talk through a little bit of the dynamics of the race as well. So you look at the map, it's almost identical, 2016 versus 2024. The only state that was different was Nevada, which obviously went for Trump this time around, did not go for him back in 2016, but every other state was the exact same. And yet I think you would have to say that there was a pretty significantly different reaction on the part of Democrats and progressives this time, because if you're right, and I think you're going to be right, that the popular vote will go in Trump's direction, and it certainly was that way on election night, That psychologically is a big blow. This is a long story, right? Back 200 years ago, 1824, Andrew Jackson, the original Democrat, really, the one who coined the party name, moved it from Democratic Republican or Republican to Democrat, had more popular votes than John Quincy Adams, had more electoral college votes, but not a majority. And the election went to the House. The House, under Henry Clay's direction, chose John Quincy Adams, and Democrats had their rallying cry that day and ever since. The popular vote ought to be the thing that decides the election. He pushed for that. As president, of course, hasn't changed in those 200 years, but it's never been popular, and it's never been popular with the Democratic Party in particular. So back in 2016, of course, they could console themselves. Well, sure, the vagaries of the Electoral College, dead white men and all that caused us to lose this election, but really the people are with us. The people, and of course, that then justified resistance to Trump, not just because Trump being Trump, but also because it was the majority, in their view, that was with them. And so they were rightfully the champions of that majority throughout those first 4 Trump years. Not the case this time around. And you could see the psychological consequences of that on the faces and in the reactions of Democratic Party leaders as they have tried to process this over the last week plus now.
One thing I'm interested is whether or not the national popular vote movement continues to progress forward.
Yeah.
Because the visual that I saw that was very telling to me, and it played into this argument that I made, that the more south of the border you were and closer to the Mexican border you were, the more support Trump would have this election versus 2020 and 2016. So the map I looked at had these arrows. The longer the arrow, the more the delta between his 2020 vote and his 2024 vote. And when you looked at places like inland California, which you'd expect, right, to go Republican, but the shifts that were taking place there in the popular vote, where a state like California may have been 60-40 or 65-35 for Joe Biden in 2020, was now more like 58-42. And those 6 or 7 percentage points in those larger blue states all across the country, Illinois, New York was another place where this happened, made a big difference with regard to the end tally of the popular vote. So we won't say now we need to get away from the Electoral College because it seems like the national popular vote is going our way. But I wonder if there'll still be as much of a push there given the results of the 2024 election.
Yeah, I thought about that too. You're right. And it was really dramatic. 49 of 50 states. Trump did better this time than last time around. So, and of course, that was true of almost every demographic group as well. Anyway, you cut it. He was more popular this time than he was 4 years ago. And so, how do you explain that if you're in the Democratic leadership? That's the question they have to deal with moving forward. And, what's the postmortem? What's the story they're going to tell themselves and try to tell the nation as they go into the wilderness for 4 more years?
Yeah, I enjoyed, Matt, the analysis that you gave from a historical standpoint of the movement for a national vote. I think philosophically something big is going on here that is likewise kind of a multi-generational impulse. There's a greatly famous public and intellectual named Francis Fukuyama, who wrote in the mid-90s about the end of history thesis. And he argued that in most societies around the world, there is a movement after the death of fascism and Nazism in Germany and the death of communism in the Soviet Union. We are going to move to a world that he defined as neoliberal, which simply meant for Fukuyama that with regard to economic matters, markets, capitalism, and so on, we try to increase the pie to the greatest degree we could through free trade. So people on the left would have to embrace free trade measures, corporations, et cetera, in order to increase that pie. But with regard to social and moral issues, there'd be a deference paid to the individual to decide for themselves. So liberalism in terms of markets, but liberalism also in terms of social policy. And Fukuyama argued that that's the way the world is going. We're going to reach the end of history eventually. But he wrote a piece in commenting on this election in which he looked at the Trump victory in 2016 as accidental, but the Trump victory in 2024 as perhaps a real challenge to neoliberalism. And you look at the Trump supporters, who do they tend to be? A lot of them tended to be former Democrats, right, who have embraced his argument that within economics, there ought to be national economic policies that benefit the populace, and who want to take, I would say, a more normal stand with regard to contentious social issues. Should boys play in female sports, et cetera? So you see in the Trump victory, I think, some cracks in the neoliberal wall in American domestic politics, quite similar to the same cracks that you saw within it after 9/11, when we were just amazed that people would be so much in a state of mania that they would perform a terrorist act against another nation, and what we saw that horrible day. Here we are in 2024 with, I think, a reimagined political makeup in the United States that might have longer term consequences, where you might see the uppercase R Republican Party play the role that the uppercase D Democrat Party played in the 20th century.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think there's certainly some on the left who are interpreting the election in those terms. And you saw people like Bernie Sanders coming out and say, "Yeah, we forgot the working class. Right? We forgot about the victims of globalization." And of course, really going back to his playbook from 2016 and 2020, you saw others, more moderate Democrats, who said, "Yeah, no, it's really wokeism. Right? It was the transgender questions and things of that sort. We went way out over our skis on those issues and really tried to force people to adopt ideas that contrary to common sense and nature that they just weren't going to have. And you might try to silence them. You might be successful in some context of shutting them down. But when they got in the voting booth, they could vote the way they thought. And they didn't have to be silenced by the social pressure, perhaps, to mouth various progressive pieties." So, yeah, that's certainly one interpretation. I think that's the minority report at this point. A lot of Democrats in the immediate aftermath of the election are blaming Joe Biden. He should have dropped out. He should have given up earlier, or maybe should not have even run for re-election. The problem is after the 2022 midterm, it looked like he was popular, or at least he hadn't sunk the ship. And so it was difficult at that point to push him out as they might have expected to. I think had the election gone badly, we would have been reading New York Times articles about how he was slipping, how there were concerns about ethics and Hunter Biden, all those kinds of things. That would have started to appear probably December of 2022. But then the election went pretty well for Democrats, and they didn't get those kind of articles. And so there he was, convinced he was the only one who could stop Trump again. And of course, only too late did he realize, or was he sort of strong-armed into concluding that he couldn't run this time around. So that's the second line of argument, which of course is pretty easy because you blame Biden, you're off the hook, right? No policy changes, just bad circumstances. And then I think the third argument, which is the most destructive for the progressive standpoint, is, well, it's really the voters' fault, right? This is just confirming our prior opinion that most Americans are misogynists, racists, would-be fascists, that it wasn't really Harris and Trump that were on the ballot, it was the American people. And they lost, right? They failed. They had one job, which was to reject all those isms. They didn't do that. And so now we can confirm our prior judgment that America is this hopelessly besotted nation that really deserves its decline and destruction. And that if America's lucky, we'll be around to pick up the pieces. But in the meantime, it's going to get what it deserves.
Well, I would say, Matt, that of all the articles I read after last Tuesday's result, the article that struck me with the most accuracy as to what is going on was a piece written by the former Atlantic writer David Samuels, titled "The Time Has Now Arrived for Obama to Leave Washington." And instead of placing the blame on Vice President Harris or President Biden, Samuels places the blame on, I think, what you would call the Clinton, Obama, Hollywood, big tech cabal that behind the scenes has operated the Democrat organization in Washington, D.C., and has pulled the levers and were responsible for Joe Biden getting out of the race. Were in part responsible for Vice President Harris having an easy path to, I don't know if you can call it a nomination, it was an anointing.
Right.
So they got what they wanted, and what they wanted was the opportunity to continue to play puppet master on the scene. So this may not only be a rejection of neoliberalism, of globalization, of wokeism to some degree. I mean, it's still a 2% victory, but
Right.
in many ways it may be a rejection of those behind the scenes players who I think in part have a great level of disrespect toward the American people and would agree with that third thesis that you laid out.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's no surprise that we had the garbage line from Joe Biden, which builds on the bitter clingers and the other lines we had from Hillary Clinton and Obama, even in the early days of his campaign. So yeah, there's no question that there's a certain contempt for that conservative, often rural, now Trump voter that's been there for quite some while. I mean, it's been, 16 years since President Obama was first elected. And so we're talking about half a generation that's had that group of leaders and that orientation toward the people that became the Trump base. So I think the question is, yeah, where does Democratic Party go from here? They have no natural leaders anymore. All those who have tried to pull the strings failed. And while I think there's no question that President Obama will remain very popular within the Democratic Party, President Clinton as well, to a certain degree, nevertheless, there's going to be a group that's going to start to agitate for new leaders. And we'll see where the momentum comes from. Will that be a centrist type? Will there be an attempt to kind of go back to the late 80s, early 90s and find that new Bill Clinton type, the new Democrat, a new Democrat? Or will it be doubling down on progressivism? And will it be a Gavin Newsom type who steps forward as really the new leader of the opposition? You saw there were several auditions for that. I think it was about 2 days after the election, he announced he was calling a special session of the California legislature to Trump-proof the state, whatever that means. Really very little that Trump's presidency was going to do, but he's trying to, performative gesture there to lay his claim as the new leader of the resistance. There were a few others as well that were talking in those terms. But what about like a Josh Shapiro? Would
I think
will
Shapiro is the one. I think you're on the right track here, Matt. I think in thinking who will be the Democrat Party's next Bill Clinton in 2028?
yeah,
Will that be a governor? Will that be a centrist? And how will they be able to hold these two parts of the Democrat coalition together? And I immediately think of Shapiro. I think because I'm an East Coaster, I think of a kind of East Coaster with grit who's had enough, right, and is ready for something new and is independent enough from what I call the cabal to be able to set a new. And I would point out one last thing. It seems to me that they might have a ready-made ally in former President Joe Biden, to the degree that Biden could have an impact on what 2028 looked like. I didn't get the sense that he was incredibly happy the last 3 or 4 months having to pull out of this race.
right.
And I won't go the conspiracy track saying that the garbage comment was on purpose to undermine Vice President Harris's campaign, but he seemed very warm and welcoming to Donald Trump back to the White House. And I think he may have had enough of this, what I called cabal, that kept him out of the race, right, in 2016,
Right.
kept him out of the race in 2024, and he was the one who won in 2020. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, he's got a different story to tell, right? When he was given the chance, he won, and that group lost to Donald Trump twice. So I'm sure that's, given his vanity, I'm sure that's how he's going to tell the story till his dying day. So how about Republicans? Where do they go from here? We've got a new Senate Majority Leader, John Thune. Speaker of the House will be Mike Johnson again, apparently. And over the last week or so, the nominations for cabinet and other high-level positions have been coming fast and furious, probably three since we started recording, the way that President Trump's been rolling those out. So what do you see in terms of the early returns here, the choice of Thune, some of the early nominees? Is there any common theme? Is there anything you can take out of this that suggests a direction for Trump, for the party overall, for the nation, insofar as these institutions are able to direct the nation?
To the degree Republicans will control both houses, I think it's more likely that more of a portion of Trump's policy priorities get through both houses and get through both houses sooner than later. I still, however, don't see Washington, D.C. I still don't see the legislative branch breaking free from a lot of the things that have corrupted Washington, D.C. to this point. I still believe that it will very much be held in lobbyists' hands. I think that you'll see this in either accepting or denying some of President Trump's nominees. So I don't get the sense in John Thune's leadership of the Senate that somehow things are going to change dramatically from Mitch McConnell's leadership. Likewise with Mike Johnson. And I just think it's just the nature of the makeup of both Republican majorities in both those houses. It's just not a makeup that is 100% pro-Trump or 100% anti-Trump. It's probably 2/3 that are really in favor of what Trump's doing, 1/3 who are going to keep quiet and vote 75% of the time for what Trump wants, but really don't like him as a person and really don't like his movement as a movement.
Yeah, it's going to be very narrow majorities in both cases. I mean, it's had this kind of feeling of a landslide, but the reality is 53-47 when you've got Elisa Murkowski, Susan Collins among the 53, maybe a 5-seat or so margin in the House. We saw how that worked the last couple of years. Very, very difficult, right? Just a few people can stop something from happening in both of those chambers. And so it's going to be very difficult once the early days and some of the early momentum begins to wear off, and perhaps popularity and other things start to go down, as they just almost always do as you get 6 months into a new term. I think it's going to be difficult for President Trump to push his agenda through. So I think you're right. We'll see an active first 3 months, maybe 4 months, to try to do as many of his priorities and get them through as possible. And then from there, probably the slog that we're used to, and then of course the midterm comes along, and if that changes things, then that brings new dynamics as well. One of the things we're seeing in terms of these cabinet appointments is the importance of national security. Many of the early appointments were national security appointments, and it seems personal loyalty, or at least people that Trump believes he can trust. Maybe he hasn't always been that way. Marco Rubio was certainly no friend of his back in 2016, but they've made peace. Trump has, to his credit, an ability to forgive and forget, so long as you're with him now, and with him vociferously now. But how about this group, Dave, that's been assembled so far? Again, a lot of emphasis on those national security type of positions to date.
Well, we had thought before today's show that we might use Tocqueville's crystal ball to guess who these appointees would be.
Yeah.
And then we shifted to a gradebook for each individual appointment. I think we could do that, and that's great. It'd be interesting to kind of go through the list. I think overall, if I were to grade the appointments based upon his argument in the election, was that they're at an A-, B+. Now, who knows? Some people have said that with some of the appointments that seem a little out there, that he's playing 3D chess with everyone else. But I do think focusing on national security first is important. I think there's another question in play here, though, Matt, and that's the question of where the American Republic stands in the year 2024. We've seen things happen over the last 8, 16, 20 years that are even different from the Vietnam era division within the country, where the levers of government are often used against your political opponent. And some would argue that because of that, where we actually stand as a republic right now is in the post-American republic. So there's still a United States of America, but it's not a republic you can keep anymore. Now, if that's the case, then that's a representation of the situation that we're kind of at war with one another. And if you analyze Trump's appointees from the standpoint that we're at war with one another, his desire to have people that are loyal to him might make sense for the administration. But if we were to look at it from a Republican standpoint, where we still have a republic that we want to keep, there's some danger here, particularly in Trump's assessment of the situation, that he should be able to make whatever appointments he wants, in recess appointments or non-recess appointments, that he ought to be able to get everything he wants above and beyond the constitutional strictures that are in place in the advice and consent process.
I think that's a real interesting dynamic here. He said before the vote for Senate Majority Leader that he didn't choose one candidate or another, but he said whoever it's going to be has got to be in favor of recess appointments. Now, he didn't explain what he meant by that exactly, and there's different theories about what he meant. It's been the practice in recent years for the Senate to have what are called pro forma sessions that basically, don't do any business, but you meet a few people, you have gavel in, gavel out. And what that means is that you're not in recess long enough for an appointment to be made. The Supreme Court ruled 10 years ago had to be at least 10-day recess before you could have a recess appointment. Now, interestingly enough, that was not the conservatives on the court that made that decision. So the conservatives voted against that decision and argued that there should be no recess appointments during a given session of the Congress. And so a session runs from, let's say, January 3rd to September, October, whenever they have their final recess for the year. So that whole 9-month period is a session. Okay, and the argument was the only time when you ought to have a recess appointment is when it's after that. Let's say somebody dies in November, Congress won't meet again until January. 2 months, you need a Secretary of Defense. Let's say you appoint somebody for that interim. They can stay in there until the end of that next session. That's the Constitution's provision for all this. But what's happened in more recent years is if the Congress just takes a break mid-session for 2 weeks, let's say they go home for Memorial Day or July 4th or something like that, then presidents jump in there and make recess appointments. Not clear that that's the founder's intent. What Trump is talking about potentially is even more extreme, which is the possibility that once Inauguration Day comes and goes, all of a sudden the Senate will adjourn for a 10-day period or more, and he'll make a whole bunch of appointments, normal appointments, without having to go through advice and consent. So all of a sudden, this whole slate of people that he's rolled out in the last few days, no vote in the Senate, no hearings in the Senate, no debate in the Senate, all of a sudden they're in office and they can be there all the way up until the midterm without being formally approved. Now, he hasn't come right out and said that's what he's talking about, but there's people behind the scenes that are saying this is what the conversation is. And I think, there's no need for that, number one, because he can get his appointments through. He has a majority. Only the worst appointments will be challenged, and they ought to be challenged. But in the meantime, that also, if we're not in a post-Republican context yet, that certainly puts us on that kind of a footing, right? Where we're more or less saying the Senate in its traditional role, its universally understood role as giving advice and consent over major appointments, no longer is needed.
Well, let me interject here with a little inside baseball. My last fall at the King's College, I got a call from our former, now deceased mentor, Angelo Codevilla, and one of his other students in his past who had a much more successful financial career than either of us was being asked by President Trump to lead the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. This had been a board that had been started by President Eisenhower. You remember his famous farewell address in 1960, that beware of the military-industrial complex, to oversee intelligence and national security agencies within the White House. This board could be shaped, appointed by the president at his will, and given its marching orders by the president as well. So this individual, this other student of Angelo Codevilla's, went and spoke with Angelo Codevilla and asked his opinion on the matter. And Professor Codevilla said, of course, that's the agency we ought to be using to prevent the intelligence agencies from undermining your policies and eventually, as some would argue, becoming a deep state. But he said you have to require one thing of President Trump if you're going to lead this board, and that is that you do away with all security clearances from agencies on who the board members are and what its activities will become. Security clearance was key to Codevilla. For what reason? Well, why would you want to have to receive security clearance from an agency that you were overseeing if it was doing the wrong thing? In that case, Trump told this individual, no, I'm not going to do that. And this individual stepped away from the opportunity of being part of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, maybe President Trump has learned his lesson on this front. I'm not saying the ploy with regard to recess appointments is correct, but to what degree do you have to say the President of the United States is commander-in-chief and ought to have the requisite powers to be commander-in-chief and to carry out the constitutional tasks of the executive? If you've given over power to agencies that ought to be partnering with you to secure the American way of life, then they, in fact, become the executive in these affairs rather than you. So really, really interesting what's going to happen here. But let me say one more thing about these appointees. I always think there's a readily easy to find double standard when one party gains control after the other's been in control. So what I did, Matt, is I took out a piece of paper and I put two columns on it, and I titled the paper "A Tale of Two Petes." In the left column, I had Mayor Pete, born in 1982, Harvard degree, Phi Beta Kappa, consultant at McKinsey and so on, yada, yada, yada. Great story. On the right side, I had the incredibly hard to understand, tongue-in-cheek, appointment of Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense with almost the completely same resume CV on the right side. So what's so good about Mayor Pete that makes him a good prospective president and someone who now leads as Secretary of Transportation, overseeing 55,000 employees and 13 agencies? But Pete Hegseth is nowhere near ready to be Secretary of Defense, according to these same people, even though that he's a good childhood friend of our former colleague, Brian Brenberg,
Right.
of all things.
If that doesn't seal the deal.
Think of what could happen to Brian Brenberg's Fox career if Pete takes on this position. I'm putting Brian Brenberg in prime time at that point.
Yeah, or Fox and Friends, right? There's an opening. So yeah, let's get it done. So I think you're right. There's absolutely a double standard. And I think to go back to your broader point, there's no question that what President Trump is looking for is people that will not kowtow to the established career employees in these agencies. He needs people like that who are going to go in there and be willing to fire people that need to be fired and insist upon carrying out the policies of the administration rather than just trying to hold on for 4 years and wait out another presidency. So there's no question about that. I think the problem is that Trump in his nature is always attracted to the show horses. And what he needs is more of the workhorses. Right? What he needs is the person who's actually willing to go in there and dig through the files and figure out where the trouble really is coming from, shut down the agencies that aren't doing the job or that are actually working opposite of your agenda, right? Actually do the hard work rather than be auditioning constantly for the Fox News hit, rather than being the one who wants to tweet out the thing that goes viral. Because the actual work of governing and restoring executive leadership to the executive branch, and let's say, let's have the legislative branch do its job too, actually getting back to a real separation of power system with an executive that leads and can control policy is going to take work and not just showmanship. And I'm afraid that President Trump's tendency is always to enjoy the show more than the work.
And not this show, by the way.
Not yet.
But I have an idea about this show. Because when you were just going through that list of attributes that are needed in order to serve in these positions well as appointees, whether it's in defense or you're talking leader of the CIA or Department of National Intelligence, all of these really very important positions, you just defined the person who was the workhorse on this front was our mentor, Angelo Codevilla.
Right.
I think it would be, and maybe we do this the next 5 or 6 weeks. I mean, we'll see what the downloads look like this week, but what if we were to go through Codevilla's corpus, books like Informing Statecraft, War, Ends and Means, No Victory, No Peace, Advice to War Presidents, The Character of Nations, The Ruling Class, and distill the principles of those books. If we have nominees, if we have appointees to these cabinet positions who can take from Codevilla that sensibility as to what the role of foreign policy and national security is to the life of this nation, then we'd be in good shape. But we need them to be more loyal, or at least equally loyal, to those ideas and that competence and discernment as they were to the president.
That would be a great start. Dave, I think you just committed me to 5 more episodes here. So Dr. Codavilla, unfortunately, is not here to teach his ideas himself, but we're grateful having been educated by him, and of course, he's left a great legacy of these works and the essays and his students, and there's so much wisdom there to be culled. I think we would enjoy having a chance to bring up those ideas and to put them out there, and we'll see. There's certainly a need for some effort to bring a kind of coherence to the impulse of the movement. We saw that with the Tea Party back in 2010. We wrote our book, Keeping Our Republic, with that in mind. I think, to get back to your observation earlier, I think if you wrote the same book today, it would have to be Restoring Our Republic, right? We're at a point where Republican robes are soiled, and there's a need for a real restoration of those ideas and ideals. And a lot of that is going to be tearing down some scaffolding that's been built up around the institution that has to be removed so that we can actually work on the original building and restore it to its former beauty. Well, I think we're out of time for today, Dave, but it's been a good conversation, and it sounds like we'll be back again before too long. So feel free to reach out to us as always at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
2020 vision.